Hello, I'm Ciarán Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Chocolate Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring you the latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. Ensuring lambs receive adequate colostrum is vital to get them off to the best possible start. Making sure ewes have adequate supplies is the starting point for this. We're joined by Professor Tommy Boland to discuss this in more detail in a two-part special. In this first part, we focus on the factors that influence colostrum production in the ewe. We discuss how and when production starts, and the quantity ewe needs to produce, with Tommy explaining how various nutritional factors have an impact on the quality and quantity of colostrum a ewe produces. We discuss the effects of body condition score, age and breed have on colostrum production. Tommy also explains the reason for poor milk letdown in some ewes post-lambing. Finally, we finish up discussing the importance of getting management right, not only to ensure adequate colostrum production, but also to set the ewe up for early lactation. We start off, however, with Tommy explaining the various functions of colostrum.
Yeah, Ciarán, colostrum production and colostrum consumption by the lamb, I think it's one of the key aspects of a successful lambing outcome, but also the success, setting up your flock for success for the rest of the year, really. And I think that's sometimes understated or underinvestigated. If we look at what colostrum is the first milk produced by the ewe after she gives birth. And it's a number of really important functions in the lamb. First of all, if we think of that colostrum, it's a really rich energy source for the lamb. And when the lamb is born, it needs to generate heat quickly. And if it doesn't generate that heat, it won't survive. And colostrum provides the fuel and the energy to allow it to generate the heat. It's also essential to support the health of the lamb and the immune system of the lamb. Again, when the lamb is born, it has no immunity to any disease it faces in the environment into which it's born into. And the only way it can acquire that immunity is through the consumption of the colostrum. And the colostrum contains the antibodies or the protective agents that will help that lamb to fight off the disease-causing agents in the environment. Number 3 then, and again, this is a really important function, that colostrum serves to kind of get the activity of the gut and the intestine going and to remove that debris or that meconium or that first feces that the lamb produces from the intestines. It's really important to get that substance or get that dung out of the intestine, because if it remains in place for too long, it can cause infection to develop. And then the fourth important function, or another important function, is that the ewe having colostrum present and the lamb suckling that colostrum, it's really important to allow that bond to develop between the ewe and the lamb, which will, set up that lamb for survival once your animals are turned out, or if they're born in an outdoor environment, that it gets them to bond straight away.
Like, to start with the basics, when does colostrum production start in ewes? So we're feeding ewes in late pregnancy. When does the colostrum production kick in?
Yeah, colostrum production is something that starts, in the last month of pregnancy, really, Ciarán, and it's not something that just starts the day before the ewe lambs. If we're leaving it till that point to try to do something about it, we've left it too late. So the mammary gland, the elder, will really start to develop, and we see this as springing up in the last 3 to 4 weeks of pregnancy before the ewe lambs. And during that window, the actual nutrients that are present in colostrum, they start moving in to the mammary gland or start moving into the elder from the ewe's own circulation. So it's the last 3 and 4 weeks. That's when colostrum production begins to take place in the ewe. So that's when we really need to target our nutrition so that we have the opportunity to provide the ewe with the nutrients that she requires for that colostrum production. So there's enough there when the ewe lambs down.
Just speaking about enough there, there's perhaps no harm just to re-emphasize again the quantity of colostrum that ewe needs to produce.
Yeah, of course, and that's really important. From our work in lines over the years, we would have seen that for each lamb the ewe produces, she'll need about 1 litre of colostrum over the first 24 hours of life. So if she's given birth to a single, she'll need to produce 1 litre. If she's given birth to twins, you're looking at 2 litres, and obviously triplets, you're looking at the in around the 3 litre mark. So it's a substantial energy and nutrient output by the ewe.
It's probably something we underestimate quite a lot, and we'll probably come back to it in the latter half of the podcast when we talk about the lambs. Look, at quantity is one thing, quality is the other, and here's where nutrition has a big impact on it. Why does it matter so much, Tommy, and how does nutrition or that ration we use in late pregnancy influence the quality of the colostrum we produce?
Yeah, and this is a really detailed question, Ciarán, and we could have a whole podcast on that question just by itself. But if you look at what colostrum is in the first place, colostrum is a really nutrient-dense substance. It's full of energy, it's full of fat, and it's full of proteins or amino acids. And all of those are they're nutrients that need to be supplied by the diet. And if they're not supplied by the diet, unfortunately, the ewe is going to attempt to use her own body reserves to supply those components into colostrum. So the first thing you look at is energy. The energy requirements of the ewe will increase by about 80 to 100% as she goes from mid-pregnancy into late pregnancy. And if we're looking at our indoor housing systems, we're looking at supplying concentrate supplementation to the ewe in late gestation to actually meet that energy requirement. The vast majority of our silages won't do it for single bearing ewes, and they certainly won't do it for twin bearing ewes. So we need to look at feeding a concentrate in late pregnancy that has high quality energy containing ingredients. And at the moment, the best ingredients we have there are the cereal grains, barley and wheat and maize. If we don't supply that energy through the concentrate feeding, then the ewe is going to utilize her own energy reserves or the fat she has on her back to try and make up the deficit. And, my opinion at this stage is that we really need to keep that energy reserve for the ewe in gestation so that she can actually use that energy reserve to produce milk to feed our lamb or lambs in the first 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks of life. So that's the energy part of the conundrum. Protein then is the secondary or not secondary, but protein is the second nutrient we need to be really conscious of. And with protein, what we see again is that the requirements in the ewe's diet, again, they're pretty much double as we go from mid-pregnancy into late pregnancy. So we normally talk about, offering ewes between 180 to 200 grams of crude protein per day. The reason why the crude protein requirement is so high in late pregnancy is the lamb is growing in utero or in the lamb bed, and that requires amino acids and proteins because the lamb is developing muscle and the various tissues in its body. But also colostrum has an exceptionally high protein content itself. The protein content of colostrum is about 20%, that first colostrum the ewe produces. So we need to supply that protein in the diet to allow that colostrum to develop and to concentrate those proteins, which are actually, in many cases, the disease-preventing agents present in the colostrum. It's not just total protein that we're concerned about. We need to focus on this particular type of protein, which is called rumen bypass protein. And without getting too technical on it, these are amino acids which are present in the diet, normally in the concentrate portion of the diet, which are not digested in the rumen, but they pass straight through the rumen without being broken down, and they become available for usage by the ewe in the small intestine. And it's those bypass proteins which are really, really important in the production of the colostrum and supporting that colostrum production. And if we're looking at ingredients that offer good sources of that bypass protein, soybean meal is probably the best one we have currently available on the market.
It's one time a year where you really have to invest in what we're feeding. Look, you touched on this already. There are other factors that influence colostrum production. So the nutrition is the major end of it. You mentioned condition. Has that an impact on colostrum production?
Yes, it does. And particularly in situations where the ewe is over-conditioned. So, and it's probably something that is overlooked. We would see our optimal levels of colostrum production taking place when the ewe is in that body condition score of 3 to 3.5. Once you go above that range, what happens when the ewe is being overfed and she's laying down fat? Not only does she lay down fat, the subcutaneous fat or the fat along the back that we see and we feel when we body condition score ewes, but fatty tissue is also laid down in the elder or in the mammary gland, and it's laid down in the liver. And the lay down or the deposition of fat in the mammary gland means that there are less, I suppose, cells there to produce colostrum and to concentrate the antibodies. So your colostrum production is impacted from that perspective. And also, when the fat is laid down in the liver, that can have an impact of basically reducing the functionality of the ewe in total. The liver is like the engine which powers the animal. If that liver is not working to its optimum, the output by the animal is going to be reduced. And one of the ways we see that with the ewe in late pregnancy is that she is slower to come to her milk. So you look at this ewe when she's in good condition, you say, oh, that ewe has been well fed and she should have lots of milk or lots of colostrum. And actually what you see in a lot of cases is that the ewe has very little or no colostrum produced at the time she needs it, so straight after she gives birth. So with the condition score, I'd be more concerned about ewes being over-conditioned in late pregnancy rather than ewes being a little bit under-conditioned in late pregnancy, because you can, if you feed that thin ewe to her actual requirements, that will go a long way to supporting colostrum production.
There's probably two ends of that we'll just tease out a bit more. I'll come back to the over-condition ewe in a moment, but that thin ewe, Tommy, is probably a misconception too that we can put condition on them in late pregnancy. They will partition that energy that they've been fed if we meet the requirements more towards the lamb and lactation.
Yeah, so the ewe in late pregnancy, she's conditioned to prioritize lamb production. So the development of a lamb and the production of colostrum, and really that it's like late pregnancy is a window where we really have to be on top of it, because it's very hard to solve problems in late pregnancy if we allow problems to develop. And there's a lot of data going back 20, 30, 40, 50 years that will show we can modify lamb birth weight to some extent by manipulating feeding and feed levels in late pregnancy, but it's probably not as much as we can think. But at the same time, it's also very difficult to get that thin ewe to lay on a lot of condition in late pregnancy, because she's physiologically programmed to support the lamb and to support colostrum production. But what I would be looking at with those under-conditioned ewes in late pregnancy here is to feed them to the requirements that they have, so that we're not mobilizing any more of that body condition in late pregnancy. And really, when we use that body condition in late pregnancy, we don't have it, or the ewe doesn't have it there to utilize to support the lamb in early lactation. And the ewe's requirements in early lactation are almost double what they are in late pregnancy. So it's a much more valuable resource to utilize in early lactation as opposed to utilizing it in late pregnancy. We can and we should be able to supplement the ewe in a much more controlled fashion in late pregnancy than we can in early lactation.
Tommy, I digress slightly, and we'll come back to the over-condition bit in a minute. One of the other impacts that will inherently be there in flocks in terms of colostrum production is the age of the ewe. So our first lambers relative to older ewes, there will be a bit of a difference there in their colostrum production potential.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at those first lambers, let the ewe lambs in particular, our hoggets, they're still developing, they're still growing. So they have greater nutrient demands per unit of feed intake than the animals that are 3 and 4 years old. And we see this following through into milk production as well. So we certainly do need to, A, make sure we have our feeding programs for those younger sheep absolutely correct, and B, be ready to intervene if some of those animals don't have sufficient colostrum produced at birth.
Tommy, just to bring that to the other end of the scale, older ewes and flocks, particularly the very old ewes that may be compromised in other ways, will they have an impact on colostrum production?
Anything that's going to compromise feed intake is going to compromise colostrum production, because feed intake is how the animal gets the energy into the body, and colostrum production is one of the ways it puts the energy or the nutrients out. So if you have problems with dentition, or if ewes have maybe suffered a little bit of liver damage from liver fluke, or if ewes are lame and they're not able to access the feed as you would like, all of those are going to impact on feed intake, which are going to knock on and have impacts on colostrum production. But the fact that a ewe is old by itself is not a major challenge, but if that age is impacting some other way that the ewe is functioning, like I say, let it be teat or persistently poor condition, then that will have a knock-on impact on colostrum production.
And they're all issues really should be identified for extra attention. Anyway, look, I know you've done some work on this previously, but there are some breed differences in colostrum production as well.
Yeah, no, there are some breed differences which exist. And I suppose the first thing I'd say before I get into the breed differences, I'm not a big fan of comparing one breed to another. The first thing to get right is nutrition, regardless of what breed of sheep you have. Having a breed that's predisposed to greater colostrum production won't mean a thing if they're not fed correctly. But in our work, we've looked at Suffolk cross and Texel cross, the primary, the most common commercial ewes and lowland flocks. We've looked at the Belclare and the Clen and the mule. And the mule does come out a little bit on the negative side of the graph when it comes to colostrum production immediately after birth. So when we do our research work with colostrum here, and what we would do is we'd measure colostrum production 1 hour after the yoga is birth, 10 hours after the yoga is birth, and 18 hours after the yoga is birth. And what we see consistently over 25 years at this stage is that the mule ewe, or the Leicester cross ewe, but predominantly the mule ewe, she will have lower colostrum production immediately after birth. So in that 1 hour window immediately after she gives birth. But once we get to 10 hours and 18 hours, we see no difference in colostrum production at that stage. And when we monitor lamb performance, which is indicative of milk yield, there's certainly no issue with the milk yield of the mule ewe thereafter. It's just that initial window in the immediate period after birth. Now, if we were to measure those ewes at 2 hours or 3 hours as opposed to 1, I don't know if that difference would exist.
And likely, Tommy, like every other trait, there's probably as much variation within the breed as there is between the breeds.
Yeah, that's why I said at the start, I'm not a big fan of comparing one breed to the next, because there is huge within and between breed variation. But on this particular one, we have seen it consistently being an issue with the mules over the years.
Just something to be conscious of. Look, if we just come back to your earlier point about yoke condition, something you raised there was about milk letdown, and I think it's something anyone who's been in a lambing shed is fairly familiar with. We've our ewe turns up at lambing, we fed her right, she's in good condition, has 2 lovely lambs, and a bag full of milk, but not letting it down. Apart from overconditioning, Tommy, what's the process there that prevents that milk letdown in that initial couple of hours?
Yeah, so this is, I suppose, where I get a little bit more technical and hopefully still make it somewhat understandable. But when the ewe is pregnant, there's a hormone produced in that pregnancy process called progesterone, and progesterone is a hormone which maintains pregnancy. So what we see what happens at a cellular level in the ewe, in the run up to actually giving birth, those progesterone levels start to drop, and that's the signal for the ewe to give birth. Progesterone is also the hormone that inhibits milk production. So that it basically that's why the ewe doesn't start letting down milk, or is one of the reasons why the ewe doesn't start to let down milk before she gives birth. With overconditioned ewes, as I mentioned earlier, what happens is that there is fat laid down in the liver, and the liver is the organ in the body which actually takes the progesterone out of circulation. So if that liver is over fat or is not functioning properly, the rate at which it can clear the progesterone is slowed down. So there is actually, progesterone remains in the system for longer than it otherwise would if that ewe was in the optimum condition. And I'm sure people are saying, well, if the ewe has given birth, then the progesterone is gone. Yes, to some extent, but the threshold for progesterone clearance for birth is not as low as the threshold for progesterone to allow the ewe to commence milk production. So basically, the ewe has to get rid of more of the progesterone to let down milk than she does to allow her to lamb.
I mean, fascinating insight now. Look, there's another element of this. We're talking a lot about feeding for colostrum. In some ways, we're also setting that ewe up for early lactation. So by having her in suitable condition, fed right to produce enough colostrum, we're also priming her for higher levels of milk yield during early lactation.
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, there's lots of factors which affect the ewe's ability to produce milk, and some of them are genetic, and some of them are linked to litter size actually, and how the ewes with higher litter size are more, I suppose, better primed during pregnancy to produce milk. And then nutrition is obviously a key factor as well. And the nutrition again comes in here in 2 spaces here, and I think firstly it's how the mammary gland develops. So, and every farmer knows this, when the ewe is dry, the mammary gland, reduces in size, and the secretory tissue, or the actual cells in that mammary gland or in the elder that produce the milk, they die off, for want of a better description. And those secretory cells, they need to reproduce or to be laid down again in the latter stages of pregnancy. And obviously that requires energy and protein. And if the intake of those nutrients is below optimum, then the mammary gland doesn't develop to the same extent. So it really doesn't matter how we feed the ewe after lambing, that she just won't have enough secretory cells there in the mammary gland to maximize milk production. As I've already mentioned, with the overconditioned ewe, some of that space in the mammary gland that would be occupied by secretory cells or milk production cells will be occupied by fat cells. And again, that yolk won't be able to optimize or maximize the milk production. That's the first part of the equation. The second piece of the equation then is around condition, and ewes being above or below optimum condition. And again, if the ewe is below optimum condition, and I would be saying around a body condition score of 3 or maybe slightly higher at the point of lambing. If she's below that level, the amount of energy reserve that she has to produce milk is insufficient to allow her to maximize her milk production. So basically, if you view that body condition reserve, and body condition is basically fat, most of it is comprised of fat. If you view that as money in the bank, and if you view early lactation as the time when the ewe hits on hard times and she needs to borrow that money from the bank, if that money is not in the bank, if that condition is not there, the ewe is not able to make that borrowing, and herself and particularly her lamb performance suffers as a result.
I think, Tommy, one clear thing that comes out here is there's a window there that we need to manage condition right the way throughout the year to keep them in that optimal condition. And it is, in most flocks, it's only a small percentage that drift either side of it.
Yeah, and it's about having them. It's not about having them in what some people call good condition. And unfortunately, usually when I hear the term good condition, Ciarán, it means fat. It's about having them in the correct condition as opposed to this term good condition.
Tommy, fascinating insight from the ewe perspective. We might catch up with you again next week and we'll look at colostrum from the lamb perspective. Really appreciate your insights on that though.
Thanks, Ciarán.
Okay, we're going to finish the episode up at this point. As Tommy has highlighted, how we manage ewe has big influence on various aspects of performance, but in particular colostrum production. Tommy's going to join us again next week when we're going to look at colostrum from a lamb perspective, which I'd encourage you to listen into as it's very timely and relevant. That's it for me for this episode. Again, for any updates on the sheep program, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Ciarán Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and listen in to any of our episodes.